right, so today, I know you're going to be shocked to hear this. We are continuing in the heart of the matter with part 47. Woohoo! 47. Okay, this is going to be fun. This is going to be exciting. We are in the book of Romans. We're up to chapter 2. And I don't think we're going to get out of chapter 2 today. So my plan is to just deal with chapter 2. And I think we're going to cover pretty much the whole chapter. So this is either going to run a little long or be a little short. Either way, it doesn't matter. We're just going to be dealing with chapter 2 before we move on. But here's the important thing. As we go through the book of Romans, we're getting our first opportunity from the point of view of context. We're getting our first opportunity to really be put to the test. Because up to this point, reading the Old Testament or the Tanakh, we haven't really been put to the test in terms of having verses that people are using to say things different than what other verses seem to be saying. In other words, this is our first challenge in now dealing with the Apostle Paul. We're dealing with Rav Shaul. And so we're going to start getting into some of that stuff here in chapter 2. This is where we're going to really start to get into some of the things that throw people off, that mainstream Christianity has used to cause people to believe that somehow there's no need to keep the commandments anymore and those kind of things. And so what's vital as we go through this first challenging moment, because remember that the heart of the matter teaching, we started in Bereshit, in Genesis, and we have worked our way all the way up to this point. So up to this point, even going through the Gospels, we haven't really had those issues. Everything that was said was very straightforward and very consistent with what we already heard in the Tanakh. Now is the first time we're going to start hearing some things or reading some things that can be taken out of context and really be a stumbling block. I think we're going to be able to clear some of that stuff up. At least that's my hope. So let's go into chapter 2. And in chapter 2, let's remember that we're going to be building a case and we're going to be building context. And the first verse we're going to be dealing with where the word heart comes into play is in verse 5, and then we have another one in verse 15. But we're going to begin in verse 1. And we're going to try and understand context. So let's remember what was the rules of context. Number 1, who was speaking? We know this is the Apostle Paul. Number 2, who is he speaking to? Well, he's speaking to a community in Rome. Number 3, the question is, what's the issue? Why is there an issue here? What's being talked about? In other words, there's a reason for this letter. And a lot of times we think that there's a reason for a verse as opposed to a reason for a letter. Well, the verse is a part of a bigger picture. I mean, Paul wrote this letter to communicate one or several messages or points to this group in Rome. And we're going to see there actually is a very consistent theme that plays out throughout this area, which is understanding understanding the differences between righteousness and unrighteousness and how they are, how you get declared one or the other. Okay? And there's going to be this theme that plays through also with understanding this idea of the circumcision or those of the uncircumcision. And we're going to see that in that theme playing out, that it makes the most sense for us to interpret this as being those born in covenant, in other words, born of Israel, bloodline, and those that are born outside of the covenant who may then choose to become under the covenant. He's going to compare those things because we have to understand the issues of the time. The huge issue of the time that Shaul is dealing with is this infighting between those born of Israel and those born of the Goyim, or the Gentiles, coming to fellowship together or coming to unity of belief. And there was a lot of each group not looking on the other group all that favorably. There was a lot of that stuff. Those of the Israelite community, really more the Jewish community, since it was mostly Judah that was involved here, tended to look down their nose at the Gentiles who were coming into belief and were kind of puffed up and full of themselves. And so there was also this idea of those coming from the Gentiles' beliefs that, well, we just realized that we need to let go of all this paganism that we're doing. We don't want to just embrace anything. And so there was a reluctance to embrace. And so you have this puffed up group on one side and another group that's reluctant to really fully join in. And you've got this kind of non-congruent area going on. They're not merging together. They're not meshing well together. They're not becoming echad. They're not becoming truly family. And that's kind of what this letter is really dealing with to a large degree, at least in the beginning chapters. Okay? So let's kind of go through that with understanding that context and framework. He says in chapter 2 and verse 1, therefore, O man, you are without excuse. Okay, you are without excuse. Everyone who judges, for in which you judge another, you condemn yourself, since you who judge practice the same wrong. So he's talking to both groups saying, you guys are not getting along here. You're judging each other. But you're without excuse. He says, we know that the judgment of Elohim is according to truth against those who practice such wrongs. And do you think, O man, you who judge those practicing such wrongs, and doing the same, that you shall escape the judgment of Elohim? So now he's talking about a problem with hypocrisy. So one of the things that he's going to talk about a lot in this letter to the Romans here is there are those that talk the talk real good, they're not walking the walk. So talking the talk avails nothing is going to be a part of his theme here. We're dealing with hypocrisy. So he says, do you then, if you're doing these things, in other words, if you're practicing them and you should know better, do you think that you will escape the judgment of Elohim? Verse 4, or do you despise the riches of his kindness and tolerance and patience, not knowing that the kindness of Elohim leads you to repentance? But according to your hardness and unrepentant heart, you are treasuring up for yourself wrath in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of Elohim. Okay, so he's now laying a foundation. This is what's coming, folks. He says, you are laying up for yourself treasures. And we've had other verses that we've dealt with in this teaching about laying up treasures in heaven. Okay, Messiah talked about this. So he's saying, look, you're laying up treasures, but it's the hardness and unrepentance of your heart that's laying up the treasures that's going to lead to problems. He says, because Elohim is going to have righteous judgment in that day. He says, in that day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of Elohim, Elohim shall render to each one according to his works. Elohim is going to render to each one according to his works. Now, did he say according to his faith? Did he say according to his belief? No, he said according to his works. But we're going to see even Shaul in this letter is going to connect that they are the same thing. That your works simply are the three-dimensional manifestation of your beliefs. So this is one of those sections which I've taught before. People say, oh, you're teaching salvation by works. No, I'm just reading what it says. Paul says very clearly, you are going to be under judgment according to your works. Now listen, he goes on, he says, everlasting life to those who persist in good work, seeking for esteem and respect and incorruptibility. Esteem there is better translated as honor. So those who are seeking to do what is good and honorable and respectable and incorruptible, what are they going to receive? They're going to receive everlasting life. He says, but wrath and displeasure to those who are self-seeking and do not obey the Torah, the truth, Yeshua, all interchangeable when you see the word truth. Do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness. Because the truth is the only thing that leads to righteousness. That would be Yeshua, the Torah, the commandments, etc. He says, affliction and distress on every human being working what is evil of the Yehudite first and then also the Greek. So as we're going in here, before we go any further, I want to stop and he says, look, in verse 6 it says, who shall render to each one according to his works? This is very consistent with other places. Let's go, you can hold your place here in Romans. We'll go to Matthew 16. Matthew 16 and verse 27. We're just going to read this verse. It says, for the son of Adam is going to come in the esteem of his father. So here, who's speaking? Yeshua. Okay? He says, for the son of Adam is going to come in the esteem or the honor of his father with his messengers, and then he shall reward each according to his faith, according to his altar call, according to, what does it say here? According to his works. This is why Paul says in Philippians, you need to work out your salvation. Let's understand, for those who've not heard the teaching that I did called Are You Saved, that salvation was made available free of charge once and for all when Yeshua died and was resurrected. He said, I give my life for the whole world. What he did there is different than Christianity teaches. He didn't save anybody at that moment. He made it possible for people to be saved. He made it available. Before that, it wasn't even a possibility. Now, that's not to say that everybody who died before he did this are now doomed. No, this had to happen. It just really didn't matter when. Because when it happened, it was going to affect everyone that ever lived and ever would live. But it had to happen. He was slain from the foundation of the world, we're told. He said, I give my life for the world. But we also know that not everybody gets in. Some will choose, as demonstrated by their works or their actions, some will choose not to follow in accordance and take advantage of the salvation that was offered. See, salvation has been offered to all of you. How do you demonstrate to the Father whether you're choosing to accept it or not? It's through your belief. And if you believe him, you're going to then have works and actions that come forth from your beliefs. And so Yeshua is saying the same thing here. He says, I'm going to be coming. When? This is when he's returning. This is the second coming. And he's going to come with his messengers, and then he shall reward each according to their works. So Paul understood all this. Let's go to Revelation 22. You'll see this at the very end. This is the end of it all. Yeshua promised that this would happen. Paul's quoting that this will happen. And now in Revelation 22, we'll read in verse 12. And see, I am coming speedily, and my reward is with me. What is his reward that he has with him? And I jokingly said last time that it's not a smiley face sticker. Okay, what is his reward? Eternal life. To live forever in the forever kingdom. He said, my reward is with me to give each according to his work. I am the Alpha and the Tav, the Aleph and the Tav, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. Blessed are those doing, there it is. Shame on him for mentioning that we have to do stuff. Blessed are those doing. He didn't say believing. He didn't say knowing. He didn't say studying. He said those doing his commands, so that the authority shall be theirs unto the tree of life, and to enter through the gates into the city. So those doing, remember this goes back to Romans 2, he says he will judge you according to your works, some to eternal life, which is access to the tree of life, some to condemnation and wrath, which means lake of fire time. Is it not consistent all the way through? Messiah says it in Matthew. Paul's talking about it in Romans. And then we hear it inspired here at the end that John understands this in the Revelation that he gets in the book of Revelation. That at the very end, this is the last chapter. There's only like 5 more verses and it's over. That's it. There's no more. This is how it all ends. And he says, blessed are those doing his commands. I want to take this a step further. I'm not adding to Scripture, but we talked about this. Are you a human studying, a human knowing, a human doing, or a human being Torah observant? I think ultimately he wants those that are not just doing mechanically. He wants humans being Torah observant, Torah submissive to the Father and the Son. Because a lot of us are still stuck as human studying, with some humans being a little bit of human doing. There's a lot of reluctance, though, so you're not really doing. Or you're doing, but you're not doing it in the fullness, so you're not actually being. See, you're keeping the Sabbath, you're not actually being a Sabbath observer. You're mechanically keeping the Sabbath. You're mechanically, okay, it's Saturday, and I know I have to do this, and I know I have to do that, instead of just doing it naturally. Birds don't have to think about flying. Fish don't have to think about swimming. Think about how when you're driving your car, those of you that drive, how when you leave work, how sometimes you're home and you don't remember any of it. Because you've done it so much that you're being that driver. You're not driving anymore. You're not doing it. It's so natural. You're not even paying any attention whatsoever to the pedals, to the mirrors. You did it all and somehow you left the office and now you're home. That's how Torah observance needs to become, where you're at the point where it's part of you. You don't have to consciously think about it anymore. It's just what and who you are. And he says, blessed are those doing his commands. And we can, I believe it's implied they're doing it with the right approach, with the right attitude. So that's why I turned it into that idea of being a human being the commands. Okay? Being respectful, being submitted to the commandments, being submitted to the Father and Son, being walking in those fruit of the Spirit, being joy, being love, being patient, being meek, being. See, being instead of doing. See, if you got to think about under a situation, like he says, love your enemies. Like we talk about the fruit of the Spirit from Galatians 5, and I say, well, one of the fruit is love. And so people say, well, I have love. Okay, but the answer is, yeah, you have love, but do you have love when it comes to loving your enemies? What about that level of love? That level of love requires the fruit of the Spirit. That requires the Spirit. And so the thing is, if you have an enemy, if you have to make an effort to love your enemy or think about how to do it, then you're not there yet. You're not being love. We need to be love, be joy, be patient, it has to be part of who we are. And we're going to see that's part of what Paul's talking about here in Romans chapter 2. Let's go back there now. In Romans chapter 2, we're in verse 10. I'm sorry, verse 9, he was continuing, he said, then we get to verse 10, but esteem, respect, and peace to everyone working what is good, to the Yehudite first and also to the Greek. For there is no partiality with Elohim. So now we're going to understand this is the crux of some of the issues that he's going to deal with inside of this idea of the Greek versus the Yehudite, the Jew. That's the kind of the whole point that he's trying to get into now in this chapter as we go further, is understanding the relationship between these two groups. So he says, look, there is no partiality with Elohim. There is no partiality with Elohim. Hold your place here. Go to Galatians chapter 5. We're going to jump around a little bit today to make our case, because we don't want to make our case just from Romans and have it stand alone. We want to see that it's consistent with other things that we find in other places. So this isn't the only place Paul's talking about. In Galatians, Paul talks about in chapter 5, verse 7, he says, do not be led astray. Elohim is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he shall also reap. Because he who sows to his own flesh shall reap corruption from the flesh, but he who sows to the Spirit shall reap everlasting life from the Spirit. So, in other words, there's no partiality here. You're just going to reap what you sow, whether you're Greek, whether you're Jew. So again, chapter 6, verse 7 and 8. Okay, do not be led astray. Elohim is not mocked. So what is it saying here? He's not saying it matters if you're Jew or Gentile or this or that. You will reap what you sow. And he continues to say, look, if you sow of the flesh, you're going to reap of the flesh. If you sow of the Spirit, you're going to reap of the Spirit. Okay, and what did we talk about in all the other teachings about Spirit? Spirit is the fullness of what Abba intended. So if you do what he intended in its fullness, you're going to reap from that. If you do out of your flesh, which is what he never intended, you're going to reap from that, because your flesh, he says, is corrupted. He said, if you're going to sow of your own flesh, you shall reap corruption from the flesh. Because when we think of things and filter it through the flesh, we will corrupt what we're thinking about. The flesh corrupts. In other words, it bends, it twists. It's no longer the unadulterated pure of what the Father originally gave. Okay? We add, we take away, we corrupt. Think about, back in the days when we used to have, albums, vinyl albums for records. If you scratched it up a little bit, it wouldn't play right, would it? Because you corrupted it. Think about if you have a computer and you have a corrupt file. Does it work anymore? No, because it's corrupted. It's still there, but something was either added or taken away from it, which made it corrupted. Something was either added or taken away. So what he's saying here is, because he who sows of his own flesh shall reap corruption from the flesh. So he's hinting at, look, you people should know better. He's not saying, we do this very often. We go, he's talking about those people out there. No, he's not. He's talking to people inside. He's saying, you inside, you want to filter all of this through your flesh, you're going to end up in big trouble because you're going to corrupt it. Paul's speaking to those of the Galatians that were trying to be a part of the body. He wasn't talking to just the public. And he's saying, look, don't corrupt this thing. Leave it pure. He says, but he who sows to the clean, the pure, the Spirit, shall reap everlasting life with or from the Spirit. Now remember, let's not take this into more evangelical understanding of thinking that somehow this is like we're reaping from some outside entity. It's much more simple than that. The Spirit of the fullness of how he intended things. Now, let's continue. And I have a whole teaching that we deal with that, okay, called Understanding the Ruach, Understanding the Spirit. Let's go back to chapter 2 of Romans, chapter 2. Now we're going to read into verse 12. Now we're going to really start to get into some interesting things here, starting in verse 12. For as many as sinned without Torah shall also perish without Torah, and as many as sinned in the Torah shall be judged by the Torah. What in the world does that mean? Okay, let me reword this, and this is my rewording. If it's wrong, then it's on me. But let me help to understand using what I believe is Paul's metaphors here. He's saying that those that sinned without the Torah, in other words, the non-covenanted people, in other words, not because they didn't know Torah, because they were not part of that covenant. He says he's trying to make a distinction. He's going to use circumcision later. Now he's using those with the Torah and those without the Torah to basically have to do with where you were born. In other words, he's saying those, as many as sinned without being part of the covenant, they shall also perish, having not been a part of the covenant. Now notice the difference in wording here. He's saying those outside without the covenant who break in the law and sin, who don't, because they don't have the law, they weren't part of the covenant, they shall perish. Okay, that's the key word there is perish. Now listen to the rest of it. But as many as sinned in the Torah who are covenanted, they shall be judged according to the Torah. Well, doesn't that make sense? If you're part of the covenant, then you're going to be judged according to the covenant that you made. If you're outside of the covenant, then you're simply going to perish. Does that make any sense to anyone? Okay, now let's continue because this is going to get really kind of interesting as it flows through. Hold on to these things. You'll see that my speculation here is going to make more and more sense as we go forward. Now listen, verse 13 is going to help make clarity in that. He says, for not the hearers of the Torah are righteous in the sight of Elohim, but the doers of the law shall be declared right. Amazing for all the people that want to use Paul to undermine Torah observance, forget that that verse is there. That verse is in every Bible, King James or otherwise. It says, for not the hearers of the Torah. So he's saying is, there are people out there that may have heard the Torah, back to verse 12, but had not covenanted. He says, the hearers of the Torah are not what's going to be declared right. It says, it's going to be the doers of the law shall be declared right. Let's hold on to that thought and go to Matthew chapter 7. Hold on here and go to Matthew chapter 7. We're going to see that Yeshua agreed 100% with this, or I should say Paul agreed with Yeshua. In Matthew chapter 7 and verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Master, Master, shall enter into the reign of the heavens, but he who is doing the desire of my Father in the heavens. There it is. Same thing, isn't it? He said it's not just because you say Master, Master. There's a lot of people out there claiming him as Master, but not doing. It's the doing that makes the difference. Why? Because the doing demonstrates where your heart's at. It demonstrates where your faith and belief is. The doing is the physical manifestation of everything. It's like the parable where he said to the one, go and do something, and he said no, and he went and did it anyway. And the other one said yes and didn't do it. And he said, which one was more right? Because which one really spoke louder, the words or the actions? Okay, the one who said yes, his words were meaningless because he didn't do it. The one who said no, he might have just been throwing a little rebellion out there out of his mouth, but truly in his heart he wasn't, and he went and did what he was told to do. Continuing in verse 22, we're still in Matthew 7. Many shall say to me in that day, Master, Master, have we not prophesied in your name and cast out demons in your name and done many mighty works in your name? Now, he never says, you never did any of that stuff. So let's be careful when people want to use these as evidence of being in the right place. These people were clearly in the wrong place, doing the wrong things, and yet they still were prophesying and casting out demons and doing other mighty works. So, because I've had people say, well, how come we're not doing all of this stuff in the Messianic? Because it doesn't mean anything necessarily. Clearly, these people were doing it, and it meant nothing. Because Yeshua then says to them, and then I shall declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who work lawlessness, you who are Torahists. He didn't say, you did them by another power, this, that, or that. He just said, get away from me, you who work. I don't know you. And that knowing always in the Bible is an intimate relationship. He says, we did not have an intimate relationship because if you knew me, you would have kept the commands. If you knew me, you would have done what I told you to do. If you knew me, you would have trusted me and submitted to me. But you didn't know me. So what did you do? You did lawlessness. Because if you knew me, you wouldn't have done lawlessness. He says, get away from me, you who work lawlessness. And that's the idea of working lawlessness. I think that not only were they doing it, but they were teaching it. Because these were leaders who were saying, we did all this stuff in your authority, in your name. We claimed your name. And yet still, he said, depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Continue, he says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them shall be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain came down, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them shall be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain came down, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and they beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Now let's understand what's happening in this parable, this little picture here. These are those that claim to understand, claim to have relationship, claim to be in belief. And he said, though the ones who hear the words and don't do them, what's going to happen is when people come against them, people try to shake their tree, people give them grief, and life and circumstances get on them, back to the parable of the sower and the seed, they're going to get blown away. They're going to get blown right out of it. He says, but the ones who do what I said, it's like they built their house on a rock. And when all these things happen in life, all these adverse situations, all of this attacks that you may get under and everything else, you'll be solid and the wind can blow, but you're not going anywhere. And what I think he's trying to say is that these people in verse 22 and 21, these are people that when those things happened, you know what they did? To make it all go away, they gave in and compromised and syncretized. Syncretism means to merge something together that doesn't belong. That's how you got Christmas merged into the beliefs. That's how you get Easter merged into the beliefs. That's how you get all these. Don't worry, a couple of years from now, if we're still around, Halloween has almost completely been merged into the beliefs. That's called syncretism. Okay? I think that he's saying in this parable, you who were not doing to deal with the wind and not get blown out, you made an adjustment. You bent and twisted and corrupted the word so that the wind would stop blowing. Instead of standing there against it and not letting it knock you over. You see, the ones who are built on the rock are saying, hey, give it your best shot. I'm not going anywhere. The ones built on the sand are saying, man, I better do something or I'm going to be about to get blown out. And they make adjustments by bending and twisting and corrupting. Now take that, and now let's go to James chapter 2. Before we go back to Romans, still on the same idea of not the hearers, but the doers shall be declared right. You see this in Matthew, now we're going to see this in James chapter 2. Let's go to James chapter 2. Give me 1 second. And we're going to begin in verse 14. My brothers, what use is it for anyone to say he has belief, but does not have works? This belief is unable to save him. So there it is. James, you should throw him out of your Bible. He's talking salvation by works. No, he's not. He's saying exactly what I've been saying, and that I understand it because I'm not the one who's so smart, but because I understand what they've been saying. They've all been saying that salvation is available, but you don't get to have it if you're not doing the doing. Because we all know that he said, I give my life for the whole world, and we all know that the whole world doesn't all get in. And why don't they all get in? Because some of them will choose not to. I don't understand why, but that's just what we know. It says that will happen. Though there will be those who will choose not to take advantage of the salvation being offered. He says, this belief is unable to save him. So now he's trying to explain how belief and works go together. And if a brother or sister is naked and in need of daily food, but one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, but you do not give them bodily needs, what use is it? Now, he's trying to now make this more clear. He says, look, it's like saying to a person who's hungry, go and don't feel hungry anymore. But you didn't do anything to help them. In modern day Christianity, in modern day even Messianic, it's like saying, I'll pray for you. Don't tell them you'll pray for them. First of all, pray for them right there if you can. And second of all, if it's something you can actually do something about, do something about it. Because you all know once you tell people you're going to pray for them, a good percentage of the time you forget anyway. You do. You forget. And so I learned not too long ago, but long enough ago, a lesson that if I can, I will pray with that person right there. especially if what they're asking for is prayer. It's like this person was asking for food. If a person says, I need prayer, great, let's do it right now. Now, that doesn't mean I won't then continue to pray for the person, but let's do it right now. He says, so what's the point if you're going to say, go in peace and be warmed and filled and not help them? He says, so also, verse 17, if it does not have works, belief, if it does not have works in itself is dead. If belief does not have works, it is in itself, it's dead. Because it's not that belief doesn't manifest works. It does. But in other words, he's saying there's a hypocrisy. You can't claim belief A and then do B. Because if you're doing B, your beliefs really are B. That's kind of what he's trying to say here. He says, look, you can't say that you believe A and then do B. If you believe A, then you'll do A. So he says beliefs without the works that are congruent with the belief, it's dead. It's useless belief. It means nothing. I can tell you all kinds of things I believe, but if I'm not doing them, what point was that? He says, but someone might say, you have belief and I have works. Show me your belief without your works, and I shall show you my belief by my works. He's saying, you can't do that. He says, well, I've got belief. And by the way, is this not something that we fight every day between the Messianic Torah observant people with the Christian mainstream Christian point of view, belief versus works? James is addressing it very clearly. He says, look, you want to say, well, I've got belief and you've got works. And he's saying, that's nonsense. We both have belief and we both have works. Because if you have belief, works are the fruit of those beliefs. They are what comes forth out of belief. If I believe it's safe to touch something, I probably will go over and touch it. If I don't believe it's safe to touch it, I probably won't. Why? Because it has to do with my belief. But if I tell you that I don't believe something, and then I go and do something that proves that I do believe it, or I tell you I believe something, I go and do something that shows I don't, well, what was the real truth there? The words or the actions? So he's saying, look, I will show you my belief with my works. Because if you want to show me your hypocrisy, which is beliefs without works, well, I'm going to show you that I'm congruent. I don't have hypocrisy here. 19, verse 19, you believe that Elohim is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. Okay, so there he says, well, there you go. There's a belief, big deal. The demons believe the same thing. There's a lot of people out there that believe that the Messiah of the book that's called the Scriptures, the Bible, that Messiah is the Messiah. But do they live in accordance with that understanding that proves that they actually believe he's Messiah? Or they just believe informationally that he's Messiah? He says, but do you wish to know, O foolish man, that belief, the belief without the works is dead? Was not Abraham our father declared right by works? Now he's referring to what? There's a verse that says, and Abraham was declared right by belief, right? And he's trying to tell, I bet you, I don't know, I'm not a betting man, whatever, but I guarantee you that we have a really good chance here that James had to deal with the same thing I have to deal with and every other rabbi out there, Messianic rabbi deals with, which is this idea that, well, Abraham was declared right by faith. Do you think James heard that 4 or 5 dozen million times? Why do you think he's bringing it up here? He's saying, was not Abraham our father declared right by works when he offered Yitzchak, his son, on the altar? Do you see that the belief was working with the works, and by the works the belief was perfected? I'm sure Yaakov dealt with this question all the time. It's not a new question. There's nothing new under the sun, as they say, right? He says, and the scripture was filled. Now, this is where we're going to read the thing that he's always dealing with. And the scripture is filled, which says, Abraham believed Elohim, and it was reckoned to him for righteousness, and he was called Elohim's friend. So now here's James in your Bible interpreting that verse from Genesis to tell you that was about works, not just about something called faith. But it was works based on faith. That he did the works because he believed. He says, you see then that a man is declared right by works and not by belief alone. And this is really the heart of the crux of the battle between mainstream Christianity and the Messianic Torah observant community. And James lays it right out there. So I don't know, I guess they just don't read James that much. He says, look, He says, man is not declared right by works, that a man is declared right by works, but not by belief alone. Isn't that essentially the battle that we run into when we fight with our friends in mainstream Christianity? Oh no, I'm declared right by faith. And James says, I'm sorry, I don't agree. This is not a complicated verse, though, subject to a lot of interpretation. It's a very simple verse. He says very clearly, a man is declared right by works and not by faith alone. And the reason he can say that is because the works are manifested out of the faith. They are a physical, three-dimensional expression of faith. He says, in the same way, was not Rahab the whore also declared right by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? For as the body without the spirit is dead, so also belief is dead without the works. And this is why the whole mainstream of Christianity is at such a problem. Their whole system is based on faith without works. Now, they'll tell you that there is works, but those are not the works of Torah. There are some that are based in Torah as well. I mean, they'll agree we shouldn't murder, they'll agree we shouldn't commit adultery and some of these things, but they're doing that from rational human thinking, realizing that these are things that they don't want. They'll tell you the 10 Commandments was done away with, all the commandments are done away with, but yet, I've often joked, but it's really not funny, but I've said, look, if you say the law has been done away with, then, and I'm doing this only out of a courtesy, I tell them, then would you mind, I'm just going to tell you, next Tuesday I'm going to come over your house, I'm going to take whatever I want, I'm going to sleep with your wife, and maybe I'll kill her when I'm done. A person will look at me like, how could you say such things? Well, what do you care? The law's been done away with. Is that a problem? Well, those laws weren't done away with. What do you mean those laws? They're part of the law. What are you, picking and choosing? Are we going to not pick and choose? Go tell all those mainstream churches that the law is done away with to stop tithing. Tithing is in the law. Why are they tithing? Why would you ask people to tithe if you're telling them that the law is done away with? It's the hypocrisy of it that Paul's trying to address that hypocrisy, so is James. Are we clear on that? Does that make any sense? They're trying to address this hypocrisy. Let's go back now to chapter 2 of Romans and verse 14. Okay, we're back in Romans chapter 2. So now remember verse 13, he said, for not the hearers of the Torah are righteous in the sight of Elohim, but the doers of the law shall be declared right. And by the way, it makes total sense when the difference between right and wrong is the only way to know it is the Torah tells you. So how can you be declared right except according to the thing that is the definition of what is right? The Torah is what defines right from wrong. Verse 14, now this gets interesting in verse 14. For when Gentiles who do not have the Torah, in other words, these are those who are not covenanted, by nature do what is in the Torah, although not having it, in other words, not covenanted, they are a Torah to themselves. Now, by the way, the Greek doesn't actually say all that. It's a little bit different. Let me kind of try to read this, verse 14 and 15, and I'm going to put in a little bit more of my own interpretation. So if you disagree with it, you're welcome to do so. So he says, look, when Gentiles who do not have the Torah by nature do what is in the Torah, although not having the Torah, they are a Torah to themselves, who show the work of Torah written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or even excusing, in the day when Elohim shall judge the secrets of men through Yeshua Messiah according to the good news. Now, Christianity, tell me if I'm wrong, because I was never really in there in the mainstream sort of sense, uses this to say that they are a Torah to themselves, so they get to decide what's right and wrong, to some degree. Is that not correct? All right? Now, does that make any sense after everything Paul just said in this chapter? Let's just let Paul be the person first of all. We have to understand, he just made this huge case for Torah observance, and now he's going to say, well, but Gentiles, they can just make up and do whatever they want. Does that interpretation make any sense? If you're reading actually more than just that verse. Let's reword the verse a little bit. For when the Gentiles who are not covenanted have an intrinsic nature to do what is in the Torah. In other words, they have a natural resonance, inclination to do what is right. By the way, I have a family that is not Torah observant. They're a Jewish family. They're secular Jews. And you know what? Generally speaking, you would think that they do what's right. Okay? Most of the people you know, by the way, in the world generally do what's right. Generally, they know they shouldn't murder, they shouldn't commit adultery, they shouldn't steal. As a matter of fact, almost every government has these as laws because they all know it's right. So what he's saying is here, he's saying, look, the Gentile, the Goyim, the person who's not covenanted, when they have an intrinsic nature to do what is in the Torah, they demonstrate that they have the Torah to some degree, right? That they have some of the Torah, showing the works of the Torah written in their hearts, being witnessed by their conscience. In other words, it's in their conscience they realize that something is right and something is wrong in line with the Torah. So in other words, covenanted or not, your Torah observance or lack thereof is what we will be judged by in the day of judgment when Elohim judges the secrets of men or the inward man. So when you worry about all your friends that are Torah observant or not, he's saying, look, Elohim shall judge the secrets. And actually the Greek word has to talk about the inward man, the hidden man. In other words, who you really are on the inside. Isn't that consistent with what we've always liked to believe, that he's going to judge who we really are on the inside, that he sees the inward man? So all he's saying here is, look, don't you on the covenanted Jewish side, because remember right now we're dealing really with Jews and Gentiles, most of Israel has been scattered away. He said, don't you be so hard on these Gentiles. A lot of them by nature in their conscience have already embraced a lot of Torah. So give them credit for that. He's saying because they have a conscience. Remember, they also have the Spirit speaking to them, trying to lead them towards the Torah. Every human being has that little voice that was part of the breath of life that we get. The only problem is that we sear our consciences, and then once we sear it by doing sin after sin after sin, the voice doesn't really get that place to speak much anymore. But he's saying here that they have a heart and a conscience for Torah. So it's not that they get to be a Torah unto themselves. They're saying it's like they have some of the Torah already, even if they haven't covenanted. Just because they haven't covenanted doesn't mean they don't have any Torah. Does that make any more sense? Is that more consistent with what Paul's been saying up to this point? See, hopefully we're dealing with some verses that have always tripped some people up. And we can finally bring some clarity to them, because this is really important that we understand. So I think that we're talking about here is that he's saying, again, this animosity, this conflict between covenanted and uncovenanted, Jew and Gentile, Torah versus lawlessness. All of this stuff is something that not only are we dealing with today, but Paul was dealing with back then with this group in Rome. So let's continue. Verse 17. He's going to kind of make this even more clear. He's going to keep repeating the same theme throughout the rest of the chapter. He says, see, you are a Jew. You are a Yehudite. And you rest on the covenant. You rest on the fact that you're covenanted. And it's not that they rest on the Torah as a law. I want you to kind of understand he's using the metaphor here of being covenanted. Saying, you as a Jew rest on the fact that you're covenanted. And make your boast in Elohim. Hey, I'm a Jew. I'm covenanted. I'm the chosen people. Okay? And what he's saying is that's nothing. It means nothing unless you're doing. Sure, you're born into it. Big deal. It doesn't mean that what you do doesn't matter. It means that what you do matters just as much as it matters to the other people, even more so, because he said that it was for the Jew first. You're supposed to be setting the example, Mr. Jew, Mr. Yehudite. It says, see, you're a Yehudite, and rest on the Torah, and make your boast in Elohim. And you know the desire of Elohim, and approve that what is superior, being instructed out of the law, out of the Torah. He says, you know this is superior to everything else that's out there. He said, and are trusting that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of foolish ones, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and of the truth in the Torah. So he's saying, look, this is what you're supposed to be. You know you're supposed to be this. You're supposed to be a light and a teacher, an instructor, and you have the form of the knowledge. In other words, you should be able to actually live and walk this out and let people see what it looks like. He says, and of the truth in the Torah. He says, but listen. He says, you then who will teach another, do you not teach yourself? You proclaim that a man should not steal. Do you steal? You say, do not commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? You who abominate idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in the law and the Torah, through the transgression of the Torah, do you disrespect Elohim? What he's saying is, first of all, let me address those who are the older brothers. I want to address first those of you who should know better. You're a Jew. You're the visible remnant of Israel. Shame on you for walking hypocrisy in front of all these people and setting such a horrible example. You are supposed to be leading the blind out of darkness, not confusing them into another pit. See, Paul's giving them a good amount of grief right here first. He says, and he makes sure that we understand what he's talking about. He's saying, look, do you say don't steal and you steal? In other words, he's saying, do you say one thing and not do it? Remember we talked about earlier, and we see the consistency, that your belief has to be consistent with your actions, and that it's your actions that are going to be the more proof of the evidence of what you really believe. And he's catching them now in this hypocrisy, saying, oh, yeah, you think, oh, you're superior, and I'm of the Yehuda, and I'm of the covenant. But are you walking in it? Now he continues as we go through this here now. So we're dealing with hypocrisy in this whole section from verse 17 forward, and we're showing that bloodline avails nothing without the works. Okay, that's the theme here. Bloodline avails nothing without the works. Now he's going to use a new metaphor of circumcision. Okay, so we're getting into verse 24. He says, for the name of Elohim is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it has been written. Okay, now my question is, how is the name of Elohim blasphemed among the Gentiles because of them? Well, because now they're learning that when I say I'm of Elohim, the old saying, your actions speak louder than your words, so I can't hear what you're saying, Your actions are so loud. So what are they imitating? My behavior. They're not imitating my words. He's saying, so Elohim is being blasphemed because all these people are learning incorrectly how to worship and submit themselves to Elohim, because they're watching your horrible examples. And they're now imitating your horrible examples. Don't tell me you've never heard this, either because of you being told this or because of your children, where somebody looked at you when you were a child and said, oh, you're just like your father. Oh, you're just like your mother. Or they look at the child and say, oh, they're just like you, or they're just like your husband, or they're just like your wife. What are they looking at? Their behavior, comparing it to what they know of your behavior. How did the child get that way? I don't know. He watched you do it and imitated you. And then you get that hypocrisy of don't do as I say, don't do as I do as I say. No, they're never going to do that. They can only do as you do. So here Paul's taking all these things that we all know is wisdom throughout the ages, and he's saying, look, you guys should know better, and because of what you're doing in this hypocrisy, because you claim such authority as being the Yehudite, he says you are blaspheming the name of Elohim among the Gentiles because of your behavior. Because they're learning the errors from you. All that is wrong that they're learning, but you're saying you're doing it in the name of Elohim. How many of you have children, you don't have to raise your hands, but have children that you raised so well in mainstream Christianity, you can't get them out now? But you raised them so well. You taught them so well. They watched you do. Now you're telling them, I was wrong, I should be doing this, and they're like, you showed me this other thing for the first 20 years of my life. I'm over here. Or 7. A lot of you have older teenagers that are really giving a struggle. Because those older teenagers were raised over there, and you raised them in it, and now you decided, well, I shouldn't say you decided, Abba called you, opened your eyes, opened your ears, opened your heart, and now you see things in a whole different way, but yet you already made that bed, and they're lying in it. So now listen how he covers starting in verse 25. For circumcision indeed profits if you practice the Torah. But if you are a transgressor of the Torah, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Okay, so if I cut the foreskin off and I don't observe the Torah, does this foreskin grow back? In other words, he's not talking about circumcision here. He's talking about, again, another metaphor for the two groups of people. So now he's talking about the metaphor of those who are born in the covenant, he's calling the circumcision, those of the circumcision, and those who are born Gentile as those born not of the circumcision. So what he's saying is, look, if you are born under the covenant, it indeed profits you if you practice the Torah. Because we're told if you're part of the covenant and you practice Torah, it blesses you, keeps you safe, right? All that good stuff. But here he says, look, however, if you transgress the Torah, your circumcision has become just as if you were a goyim, a Gentile. In other words, it availed nothing that you were circumcised or part of the covenant. It meant nothing. He says, so if an uncircumcised one verse 26, watches over the righteousness of the Torah. In other words, one who is not born into, it's not about whether they were actually physically circumcised or not. In other words, one who was not born into this actually watches over the Torah. Shall not his being born outside of the covenant be reckoned as if he was part of the covenant? In other words, this is the grafting in we're going to get to by the time we get to chapter 11. Now, we may not, I don't know what's in chapter 11 yet as part of the heart of the matter, but if you read Romans 11, it talks about the grafting in the tree. And so he's trying to help these people understand, look, you want to hold it over them, but I'm a Jew, I'm better, I'm superior. By the way, most of the Messianic Jewish groups like the MJAA, UMJC, have that hierarchy where the Jew has a higher place. Nonsense. They have a higher responsibility. Not a higher place, a higher burden of responsibility to demonstrate through their actions, through their works, what Elohim had taught in the covenant. Because the new people coming in are going to look and say, I don't know what to do. I might as well look at these guys who've been doing this for thousands of years. Well, but if you're doing it wrong, then you're blaspheming Elohim. By the way, let's not quickly take what I just said and said, okay, now we have to wipe out every traditional thing that the Jewish community does. He didn't mention one tradition in here. He mentioned literally not keeping commandments, stealing, adultery, etc. The whole tradition thing is a whole other discussion. That's not the issue here. Are we clear on that? This was much more basic. They were breaking straightforward commands. They were saying don't, but they were doing. They were saying do, but they weren't doing. And so what Paul's saying is, but look, why not get off your pedestal and realize these guys over here, just because they weren't born into this, are they not walking this thing out and demonstrating that they get it? Are they not reckoned as covenanted? See, remember, this argument's going to be continuing to the same place, and there's no difference by the time we get to Romans 11. And he talks about grafting into the tree. The theme of the book is trying to take two groups of people and get them to understand themselves and each other and see how that they're supposed to be echad in one. That's the point of the book. It's not about Torah or not Torah. They're all supposed to be doing Torah. Paul says it and he understands it. But he uses high language of metaphors and literal, we have these like, when you read like really high-level books written by really high-level authors and they use these literary, techniques that are way over our heads and we miss them. Well, Paul is a scholar of scholars and he's writing it. So previously he was using the metaphor of those of the Torah, those not of the Torah, meaning those covenanted, those uncovenanted. Now he's doing the same thing with circumcision. Those of the covenant, those uncovenanted. Let's continue and let's look at how this plays out. He says, and the uncircumcised by nature who perfects the Torah shall judge you, notwithstanding letter and circumcision, who are a transgressor of the Torah. He's saying, look, they're going to judge you because it's about doing, not about what you were born into. He says, back to verse 26, if an uncircumcised, uncovenanted person watches over the righteousness of the Torah, so again, isn't he encouraging them to keep Torah? So we can't go back to that other one where the Gentiles get to make up the law for themselves. Verse 14, but here we have, if they watch over the Torah, shall not their being uncircumcised by birth be reckoned as if they were part of the group, as a covenanted person? No second-class citizens here in the family, in the kingdom, in the body. He says, by the way, you need to know this, the uncircumcised by nature, in other words, now he's going to explain it to you. He means uncircumcised by nature. In other words, they were not born in the covenant. If that person who's keeping over the Torah, who perfects the Torah, in other words, they have integrity in walking out the Torah. We talked about this word perfection having mostly to do with integrity. That with integrity, they're walking this out. They shall judge you, notwithstanding letter. In other words, notwithstanding the fact that you went to yeshiva and you were trained and you were brought up and you have the birthright. He said, you can forget all that. What matters is what you do. What matters is what you do. Now listen to what he says now in verse 28. He kind of makes this clear. He says, for he is not a Yehudite who is so outwardly, neither is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. But a Yehudite is he who is so inwardly, and the circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit, not literally, whose praise is not from men but from Elohim. So now let's take that word circumcision again and talk about covenant. He says, look, he is not a Yehudite who is outwardly, neither is his being part of the covenant that which is an outward thing. In other words, the covenant is not just an outward manifestation. Remember, circumcision, uncircumcision is metaphors for covenanted and uncovenanted. He says, however, a Yehudite is he who is inward, and the covenant is that which is in the heart. Because remember, circumcision was a sign of what? The covenant, being covenanted. So is he attacking circumcision here? No. Let's go back and look at this whole thing with circumcision, okay? Genesis chapter 17 and verse 11. Ooh, I better go quick. Genesis 17. I knew we weren't going to get past chapter 2, but we are at the end of chapter 2 here, so we should be okay. Genesis 17 and verse 11. Okay? We're 3 verses here. And you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall become a sign of the covenant between me and you. Okay, now this is Abram being talked to here. Okay, Elohim is talking to Abram, verse 9, right? Elohim said to Abram, he says, as for you, guard my covenant, you and your seed after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you guard between me and you and your seed after you. Every male child among you shall be circumcised. And you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall become a sign of the covenant between me and you. And the son of 8 days is circumcised by you, every male child in your generations. He who is born in your house or bought with silver from any foreigner who is not your seed. He who was born in your house and he who was bought with silver, and he has to be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And an uncircumcised male child who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, his life shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Okay, Yahweh said it. He said it was forever. We cannot now all of a sudden try to bend and twist something that Paul said to try to argue that it's no longer necessary. Let's continue in Leviticus chapter 12. We're going to go through just a couple of quick points here to prove what's going on here. That's the physical circumcision was being talked about in Genesis 17. Look at Leviticus chapter 12 and in verse 43. Okay, Leviticus 12. No, I'm sorry. Leviticus 12 and verse 1. I'm sorry. It was Exodus 12, 43. I'm getting to after this. Okay, Leviticus 12, verse 1. And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, when a woman has conceived and has given birth to a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days, and in the days of her monthly separation she is unclean. And on the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin is circumcised, and she remains in the blood of her cleansing 33 days. Okay, so here we're told that, again, in Leviticus, after it happened with Abram, now Abraham is going all the way forward. Now we have Moses teaching us that this is part of the law, the circumcision on the 8th day. Now go to Exodus 12. And now we'll go to verse 43. And Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, this is the law of the Passover. No son of a stranger is to eat of it. That word there is nechar. That means a foreigner, literally like a pagan, a foreigner, someone who's not a part of the nation. But any servant of a man who has been bought for silver, when you have circumcised him, in other words, you've covenanted him, then let him eat of it. A sojourner and a hired servant does not eat of it. So now the sojourner, verse 45, is the toshav. The toshav is the idea of a resident alien. This is someone who might be living amongst them, but he's really not part of them. Okay, so he's living amongst them. The other one, more the nechar, is more the person who's traveling through. He's not living amongst you. This one, the toshav, he's living amongst you, but he's not part of the group. Like a resident alien. He says, so a resident alien and a hired servant doesn't eat of it. It is eaten in one house and not to be taken any flesh, etc. All the congregation are to perform it. Now listen to verse 48. And when a stranger, now the third word here is the ger. The ger, G-E-R, ger. When a stranger or ger, this is the proselyte. This is the one who has now gone from nechar, maybe to toshav. One of those two has decided, I want to join the nation. I've been studying and watching and observing. So it's a proselyte. And he says, look, when this ger wants to perform the Passover, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and perform it. And he shall be as a native of the land, but let no uncircumcised eat of it. This is what Paul is dealing with in chapter 2. That those who are sojourners who want to embrace the covenant and go ahead and get circumcised, they are treated as a native, as if they were actually born into the process. That birth does not make any difference. He says, listen to verse 49, there is one law, one Torah for the native born and the stranger, the ger who sojourns among you. In other words, you are to be treated equally under the law. You're the same. It doesn't matter if you were born into it or not. There's no real advantage there, except it might have been easier to embrace the covenanting if you were born into it. May have. I know a lot of people who were born into the covenanting, who were born of one of the tribes. Everybody, they all know themselves as Jews at this point, who are not really embracing the covenanting. So it has not necessarily made it easier for them. Deuteronomy chapter 10. I want you to see how important the sign of circumcision is, and that we cannot then make an argument that it was done away with. Acts 15 notwithstanding, we'll talk about that if we have time. We're running out of time as it is. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 11. Okay, Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 11. And Yahweh said to me, arise, go before the people to set out and let them go in and possess the land which I swore to their fathers. They're right there at the Jordan, ready to go into the land. And now Israel, what is Yahweh your Elohim asking of you? We all know this verse. It's something we talk about a lot. But to fear Yahweh your Elohim, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve him, and to serve your Elohim with all your heart, with all your being, to guard the commands of Yahweh and his laws, which I command you today for your good. See, the heavens and the heaven of heavens belong to Yahweh your Elohim, also the earth with all that is in it. Yahweh delighted only in your fathers to love them, and he chose their seed after them, you above all peoples, as it is today. And you shall, now I read all of that to give you the context. All of this is about these people being told what they're supposed to do and congratulating them on being those chosen people to go into the land. He says, and you shall circumcise the foreskin of your heart and harden your neck no more. For Yahweh your Elohim is Elohim of mighty ones and master of masters, the great El, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality nor takes a bribe. You see, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about no partiality from verse 11 of Romans 2. See the consistency. So if he shows no partiality, he expects everyone to get circumcised now and then and in the future. It's part of the covenant. Paul isn't talking about circumcision. He's talking about it as a metaphor. And we also have the argument with, how many of you have heard this from your friends in mainstream Christianity? Well, now it's circumcision of heart. No, it was always circumcision of heart. I just read it to you in Deuteronomy. But I've heard that. Haven't you heard that? Oh, it's no longer of flesh. Now it's of heart. No, it was always both. It was always both. I just read it to you. It's always been both. Chapter 30 of Deuteronomy in verse 1. Deuteronomy 30 in verse 1. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Deuteronomy 30, Devarim 30, verse 1. And it shall be, when all these words come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you shall bring them back to your heart among all the Gentiles where Yahweh your Elohim drives you. Okay, stop. Aren't we there now? Aren't we in this place now? This verse is talking about us, isn't it? Okay, so let's understand the context. This is talking about those that were scattered amongst the Gentiles. He said before you, and shall bring them back to your heart among the Gentiles, and shall turn back to Yahweh your Elohim and obey his voice, according to all that I command you today, with all your heart and with all your being, and you and your children. Then Yahweh your Elohim shall turn back your captivity, and shall have compassion on you, and shall turn back and gather you from all the peoples where Yahweh your Elohim has scattered you. And if any of you are driven out to the farthest parts under the heavens, from there Yahweh your Elohim does gather you, and from there he does take you. We're there now, aren't we? And Yahweh your Elohim shall bring you to the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and shall do good to them, and shall do good to you, and increase you more than your fathers. And Yahweh your Elohim shall circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed to love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and with all your being, so that you might live. You see, the circumcision of heart was still a part of what's supposed to happen now. He didn't say you would no longer have to do the one of the flesh. He says, and Yahweh your Elohim shall put all these curses on your enemies and on those who hate you, who persecuted you, and you shall turn back and obey the voice of Yahweh and do all his commands, which I command you today, which included circumcision. Okay? Now, let's go to Luke chapter 2. And this will be our last verse before I give a quick wrap up. Luke chapter 2 and verse 21. Luke 2:21. And when 8 days were completed for him, for who? For Yeshua, to be circumcised, his name was called Yeshua, the name given by the messenger before he was conceived in the womb. And when the days of her cleansing, we just read about that law in Leviticus, right? When the days of her cleansing were completed, he said, according to the Torah of Moses were completed, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to Yahweh. So we have Messiah going through exactly all of these same things. Are we not to do as he did? Well, guess what? He was circumcised the 8th day. And so let's not allow anybody to twist Acts or Paul's writings to somehow claim that circumcision has been done away with. Okay? None of the law has been done away with. There is some of the law that we can't do because there are things that are necessary to do them, but there's a difference between can't and saying won't, or I don't want to, or was done away with. Okay, there are things that we can't, if there's no temple, we can't make sacrifices. There are no Levites, there's certain things we can't do without Levites. There's, you know what I'm saying? There's things you can't do because we need things to do them that are not in place right now. But if it's something that we can do, it's still in play. It's still required. So let's understand as we're going through the book of Romans here that hopefully we understand that the heart issue that's being addressed by Paul is a heart of hierarchy, of I'm better than you. People feeling either not good enough or they're feeling superior. That was a hard issue. The Yehudim wanted to feel superior, and they wanted the Goyim who were coming into truth to feel inferior. Not good enough. You could be a wannabe, but you're not really us. We're special. No, all covenanted people are special. If you were born covenanted and we're not keeping it, you're actually the lowest. Isn't that what Yeshua said? Those who don't do the Torah and teach others not to are considered the lowest. You see? Now you understand Matthew 5:17 a little better. As you get into 5:17 and 18, where he talks about those, when they're talking in the kingdom about everybody in the past, saying, hey, remember so-and-so? How he used to break the Torah and teach others to break it? Yeah, he was the lowest. I think that's what the verse is talking about. But we need to understand, if we're looking at Paul's writings, what was Paul's message? All the way through, he's trying to say you have to keep these things. He can't all of a sudden now change it and say, yeah, but you know what, forget circumcision. And by the way, Gentiles are kind of a law unto themselves. They can do whatever they want, and they can just make up their own law. Does that actually fit everything else that Paul's been saying? No. And by the way, as we go forward, and we're going to read out of chapter 5 and then chapter 10, as we continue forward, you're going to see it's absolutely consistent all the way through. His point in the message he's trying to make, or the argument he's trying to win here, is consistent. It's about, look, guys, the Torah is for everyone. And those who are under it, those who are compliant with it, those who are covenanted, they are all equal in Abba's eyes. That's what he's trying to make a case for here. Romans 11 deals with that too when it talks about the tree. Stop trying to boast against the natural branches. The natural branches don't boast against the grafted in. Stop this fighting. That's the point of the letter. Let's see, that's why context is so important. Let's pray. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. Father, we are still going through these type of things today, Father, and we need to embrace and understand the nature of the cause, the root cause, the ego, the pride, the vanity, the insecurities, the judging, all these things that are causing us to not just love each other and appreciate each other, that we're all children in your sight, equal under the law, so to speak, equal in Torah, equal under Yeshua, and that it's about what we do, not what we claim, not what we say, not what we were born, but that, Father, our actions are what speaks volumes. So, Father, we thank you for the understanding. We thank you for the wisdom, the guidance, so that we could truly understand what you have to say in your word. Thank you so much for putting the pieces together so that we can then find the other verses that connect the dots to make a more full picture. Father, we need to truly embrace and understand what it means that you are going to render each according to his works. We need to understand that you have no partiality, that your righteousness and your righteous right rulings are forever. We have to understand what it means to be those that are covenanted and those that are not covenanted, and what you expect from those that are covenanted and those that are not covenanted. And so, Father, there's so much for us to unlearn. There's so much for us to embrace. There's so much clutter in our closets that just need to be cleaned out so that you can put all this new good stuff in there. Father, help us, wash us clean, empty us so that we can be empty, clean vessels to fill with your ways and your truth the way you truly desire us to understand them. So, Father, we come before you now just overwhelmed with appreciation, overwhelmed with joy at your mercy and compassion to call us at this time, to open up our eyes and our ears so that we can be without excuse, so that we can understand. So, Father, we thank you, we praise you, and give all honor and all glory to you in the name and authority of Yeshua our Messiah. Amen. Amen.